she faked an illness to escape the Vampire King's selection. Then he appeared at her bedside and said. The marble halls of the royal palace echoed with the sound of heels clicking against the polished floor. Isabel pressed herself against the cold wall, holding her breath as guards passed by with their torches casting dancing shadows. The selection was happening tonight, and she absolutely couldn't let anyone find her yet. She'd been counting down the days since the announcement 3 months ago. Every eligible woman in the kingdom aged 18 to 25 would be brought to the palace for a month-long evaluation. The Vampire King needed a bride, and apparently the kingdom's future depended on it. The ceremony would determine who had the strength, intelligence, and grace to become his consort. None of that mattered to Isabel. She'd spent her entire childhood reading forbidden texts about the last century's wars, about the bloodshed and suffering that came from vampire rule. Sure, things were different now, supposedly more civilized, but she wasn't about to become the ornament on some immortal's arm, regardless of how handsome the rumors made him sound. Her family had been thrilled about the selection, of course. Her mother had actually cried when the royal summons arrived, clutching the embossed invitation to her chest like it was made of gold. A daughter of our bloodline in the palace, her mother had whispered reverently. Maybe we'll finally matter, maybe we'll finally be safe. That's when the seed of the idea had planted itself in Isabel's mind. She'd spent weeks researching, asking subtle questions at the market, speaking with the herbalist who lived on the edge of town, the one everyone called a witch, but who actually just knew an uncomfortable amount about plants and their properties. The herbalist had given her the mixture with a knowing look and zero judgment, which Isabel appreciated. You want to get sick, the herbalist had said, not as a question. Bad sick, sick enough that they'll reject you from the selection. The worst, Isabel had confirmed. This will do it. High fever, sweats, chills, weakness. You'll look absolutely dreadful. It'll last about 2 weeks if you maintain it. After that you fade it slowly over another 2 weeks and you'll be fine. Nobody will suspect anything if you're careful with the dosage. Now standing in the palace corridor with her heart pounding, Isabel couldn't help but feel a small thrill at her own cleverness. She'd taken the first dose this morning, and by evening when her family arrived at the palace for the initial reception, she was already burning up. Her mother had felt her forehead and gone pale, immediately flagging down a palace official. The official had looked concerned, taken her temperature with some kind of magical device, and immediately separated her from the other candidates. We'll need to put her in isolation until we determine if this is contagious, he'd said, and just like that, Isabel was ushered away from the grand halls and the beautiful gowns, and the other young women with the glint of ambition in their eyes. She'd been placed in a comfortable room in the East Wing, clearly meant for visiting dignitaries, not plague victims, but they'd converted it quickly enough. The healer had examined her thoroughly, confirmed a high fever and general malaise, and prescribed rest and fluids. The plan was perfect. She'd stay sick for 2 weeks, long enough to miss all the important parts of the selection. By then, the king would have made his choice from the healthier candidates, and she could go home with her family's honor intact but her freedom preserved. Isabel allowed herself a small smile as she slipped back into her room and climbed into bed, pulling the heavy covers up to her chin. Through the window, she could see the courtyard below where torches lit the pathway for the selection participants. Somewhere down there, young women were being introduced to a man who'd lived for 3 centuries, who commanded armies, who apparently had eyes like molten silver according to the whispered gossip she'd overheard. She didn't care how handsome he was, she didn't care how powerful or charming. She had her own life to live, her own choices to make. This was just step 1. She drifted off to sleep, fevered and satisfied, entirely unaware that her carefully laid plans were about to encounter an obstacle she hadn't accounted for. An obstacle with fangs and an irritating habit of always getting what he wanted. King Darius was bored. He sat on the cushioned throne in the grand hall, watching as another parade of nervous young women curtsied before him, and felt the familiar weight of ennui settle over his shoulders like a familiar cloak. This was his 100th selection. Literally. He'd started these a century ago in an attempt to find some connection, some spark of genuine interest in continuing his immortal existence. It hadn't worked once. Next, he said flatly, waving his hand at his steward. The woman currently in front of him, pretty, blonde, terrified, nearly tripped over her own feet as she backed away. He felt a twinge of something that might have been guilt if he were still capable of genuine emotion. He tried to make an effort, he really did. He'd smile, ask questions about their interests, occasionally compliment their appearance. But there was always this wall of fakeness, of people performing their best selves in hopes of becoming royalty. He didn't want performance, he wanted something real. "Your Majesty," his steward Marcus leaned in close. Marcus had been with him for 70 years and had learned to read his moods. "We've had to isolate one of the candidates. High fever. The healer suspects it might be a contagious illness. She's been moved to the East Wing isolation room." Darius barely registered the information. Which one? The girl from the merchant district. The one with the dark hair and the papers listing her hobbies as reading philosophy and botany. "Your Majesty, I have to tell you, this one was unusual. During the intake interview, she seemed more interested in asking the administrators about the palace library than discussing her qualifications for becoming queen." Darius felt something shift, a tiny flicker of interest. In 300 years, interest was rare enough that he'd learned to pay attention to it. "Is that so? The healer says she'll need at least 2 weeks of isolation. She won't be participating in the selection events." "Then it doesn't matter," Darius said, but the words rang hollow even to his own ears. He was a creature of order and habit. He had a schedule. The selection ran in a specific way: interviews, dancing, tests of wit, tests of character. Over the course of a month, a pattern would emerge, and he would choose based on some vague criteria that had never really made sense to him anyway. The chosen bride would move into the palace, they'd have a pleasant enough relationship, and the kingdom would be satisfied with the arrangement. Darius had never been satisfied, but then again he'd made peace with never being satisfied. The evening proceeded as all the evenings had. More women, more curtsies, more terrified conversations. He retired to his study around midnight, feeling hollowed out and restless. Through the windows, he could see the East Wing where the sick candidate was presumably struggling through fever. Why had Marcus mentioned that one specifically? What did it matter if she was interested in philosophy and botany? What did any of it matter? He tried to read, tried to work on matters of state, tried, for a brief moment, to meditate in the way his ancient teachers had shown him centuries ago. Nothing took. His attention kept drifting to the East Wing, to the young woman who'd apparently asked more questions about a library than about a king. Around 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, Darius made a decision that violated several protocols and traditions. He left his chambers and made his way through the quiet halls to the East Wing. He'd had the palace renovated 50 years ago, and he knew exactly where the isolation room was. He stood outside the door for a full 5 minutes, which was unusual for him. Darius didn't hesitate. Hesitation was for people with fragile egos and uncertain convictions. He had neither. He turned the handle silently and stepped into the darkened room. The girl was asleep, but she was a restless sleeper. Her dark hair stuck to her forehead with perspiration, and even in the shadows he could see she was genuinely ill. The fever was real. He could smell it, that particular scent that came with genuine sickness, mixed with the herbal remedies the healers had given her. Darius approached the bed quietly, studying her face. Young, maybe 22 or 23, not conventionally beautiful in the way the others were, but there was something compelling about her features. Character, stubbornness maybe, he could see it even in sleep. She murmured something in her sleep, something that might have been a word or might have been nonsense. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids, and Darius wondered what she was dreaming about. Philosophy, botany, escape. He'd only meant to look, to satisfy the strange curiosity that Marcus's words had sparked, but he found himself reaching out, his cold fingers hovering just above her forehead, not quite touching. She stirred and her eyes fluttered open. For a moment the girl seemed confused, probably thinking she was still in her fever dreams. Then recognition of what she was seeing, or rather who she was seeing, hit her, and her entire body went rigid. "Your Majesty," she managed, her voice hoarse. Darius withdrew his hand, straightening up. In the moonlight coming through the window, he could see her eyes widen with a mixture of shock and something else. Fear, perhaps, but there was something behind the fear that interested him, a sharp intelligence calculating something. "You're burning up," he said, stating the obvious. "Yes, Your Majesty." She tried to sit up, clearly understanding that one doesn't remain lying down while the king stands at your bedside, but the effort seemed to cost her. Don't move, he commanded, and she stilled. You were in the selection. I was, Your Majesty. I apologize for my illness. The healer has assured me it's not. Not contagious. Yes, they've assured me as well. He paused. You asked about the library. She blinked. Yes, the palace library has the most remarkable collection, I'm told. I wanted to. She stopped herself, perhaps realizing she was saying too much. You wanted to what? Read, she said simply, and there was no performance in it, just honesty. Darius found himself smiling slightly. Of course you did. He should have left then, should have returned to his chambers and forgotten this strange interruption. But he stood there, looking at this feverish girl in an isolation room, and for the first time in nearly a century, he felt something that resembled genuine connection. Rest, he said finally. I'll have someone bring you better books than whatever the healers have left you. Philosophy, botany, whatever you like. Your Majesty, that's not necessary. But he was already leaving, moving back through the dark corridor with his strange new sense of purpose. Behind him, in the isolation room, Isabel lay in her bed, absolutely certain that her carefully constructed plan had just been blown to pieces by a vampire king's midnight visit. She had no idea how right she was. She also had no idea what was about to happen. By morning, Isabel was in full panic mode. The visit from the king last night had been real. She'd spent half the night convinced it was a fever dream, but when the palace servants arrived with 3 boxes of books, actually 3 boxes, she'd known for certain. Real books, philosophy, botany, literature, history. Proper books, not the light romances the healers had tried to leave her with. The note, in precise, elegant handwriting, simply said, For your recovery, D. D for Darius, the vampire king, who apparently had the ability to manifest at a young woman's bedside in the middle of the night and completely derail her entire plan. Isabel pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to think through the fever that was, annoyingly, still quite real. Her dosage of the herbalist's mixture was supposed to last 2 weeks, but she could adjust it. Maybe if she increased the dose slightly, she could spike the fever even higher, become so ill that no amount of royal attention could overcome the practical reality that she needed to be sent home. The problem was that something had shifted. The vampire king didn't show up at isolation rooms in the middle of the night for no reason. Whatever had happened, she'd somehow snagged his attention, and she had a sinking feeling that Darius didn't easily lose interest. She was right. He visited again the following night, and the night after that. Each time he brought something, a particular tea he thought might help her fever, a rare manuscript on medicinal herbs, a detailed map of the palace that he said he thought she might find interesting, given her intellectual curiosity. He didn't touch her again, but he sat in the chair beside her bed and talked. He asked her about her family, her life, her thoughts on philosophy. He told her about books he'd read centuries ago, about scholars he'd known, about the way knowledge had evolved over time. It was utterly unfair, Isabel thought. He was supposed to be terrifying. He was supposed to be exactly the kind of powerful man she'd built her entire escape around avoiding. But he was intelligent, thoughtful, and had a dry sense of humor that made her forget, for stretches of time, that she was fevered and afraid. By the 4th day she'd made a critical error. She'd started to like him. It was a problem because liking the vampire king didn't change her fundamental beliefs about her own autonomy. She still didn't want to be married. She still didn't want to be trapped. But now, when he looked at her with those impossibly silver eyes and discussed the nature of free will versus destiny, she found herself unable to maintain her perfect hatred. You're thinking something, Darius said on the 5th evening. They'd developed a rhythm where he'd arrive after sunset when her fever spiked, and they'd talk until she grew too tired to continue. I'm always thinking something, Isabel replied carefully. This is different, there's a specific thought causing you distress. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. You're wondering something about me, or perhaps about yourself. Isabel had never been good at lying face to face. How long are you going to keep visiting me? Is that a problem? It could be. Why? She turned her head away, looking toward the window. Because the selection is still happening, you should be focused on the other candidates. The other candidates are no more interesting to me than they've ever been, Darius said flatly. I attended the events this week because it was expected. I spent the time thinking about what you were reading. That Isabel stopped herself. Unfair, perhaps, he shifted forward slightly. But I'm 300 years old, and I've learned that fairness is a concept invented by people who have nothing better to do than worry about it. What I am interested in is you. The fever-sick part of Isabel's brain wanted to accept this at face value and be flattered. The clever part of her that had orchestrated an illness to escape marriage was screaming warnings. You're interested in a version of me, she said carefully. The version that's interested in books and philosophy, but that's not the whole person. Then tell me the rest. I can't. Why not? Isabel finally turned to look at him directly. Because if I do, you'll understand why I faked this illness to begin with. The words hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Darius's expression didn't change. He'd had centuries to master the art of the neutral face, but something shifted in the quality of his silence. You faked it, he said, not a question. Yes. You faked a fever to escape the selection. Yes. And the herbalist mixture you're taking is slow-acting and easily managed if you know the correct dosages. Isabel's heart sank. How did you? I'm 300 years old, little scholar. I've learned to recognize a false fever when I feel the pulse point. He stood up, moving to the window. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than angry. You didn't want the selection. You didn't want me. I didn't want to be chosen, Isabel corrected. I didn't want to have my life mapped out by a kingdom's political needs. I want to make my own decisions. Fair enough, Darius turned back to face her. And now that you've had 5 days to know me. Before Isabel could answer, there was a sharp knock on the door. Both of them went very still. The door opened without waiting for permission. A woman entered, tall, striking, with midnight black hair and clothes that suggested serious authority. Her eyes immediately fixed on Darius, and then on Isabel, and her expression shifted to something that looked remarkably like rage. Your Majesty, the woman said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute control. We need to talk, immediately. It's about the selection, and it's about her. She pointed directly at Isabel, and something in her manner suggested that whatever was about to happen, it would change everything. Darius looked at Isabel, something unreadable crossing his features. This is my sister, Queen Regent Moravath. She handles all matters of state in my absences. He glanced back at Moravath. What's happened? Your candidate, Moravath said coldly, still watching Isabel. The one from the merchant district. She's not who you think she is. We found something in the palace records in the archives you had sealed 100 years ago. You need to see this. Now. Everything in Isabel's chest went cold. Palace records, archives, sealed 100 years ago. She had no memory that went back 100 years. She had no reason to be in any ancient palace records, unless she wasn't who she thought she was either. The room Darius brought them to was hidden behind a false wall in the oldest section of the palace. Moravath carried a leather-bound journal and a collection of old photographs, the kind that had been hand-tinted centuries ago. When you sealed these records, Moravath said to Darius, I never questioned it. You were grieving, and I respected your need to bury the past. But with this girl showing up with the life debt and the connection I can see forming between you, I couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. What are you talking about? Isabel's voice came out smaller than she'd intended. Moravath opened the journal carefully. The pages were delicate, clearly very old. She pointed to a sketch, a girl with distinctive dark hair, recognizable features. It was Isabel, exactly Isabel, but the journal was dated 1823. I don't understand, Isabel whispered. You've heard of the War of the Blood Curse, Darius said quietly. He wasn't looking at the journal. He was looking at her with an expression that was suddenly very carefully controlled. The one from 90 years before I was born, Isabel managed. No, Moravath said gently. The one from 90 years before you were born this time. You've been reborn, girl, multiple times. And each time my brother has known who you were, and each time he's let you live your own life until... No, Isabel shook her head violently. That's not possible. I'm 23 years old. I have memories of my childhood, my family, my... Spelled memories, Moravath said. Artificial recollections created by some of the most powerful mages in the kingdom. They've done it each time to let you have some semblance of a normal life. But your actual soul, is reborn approximately every 100 years, and you always end up back here. Isabel sat down very hard in the nearest chair. Darius finally looked at the journal, his jaw clenched. I sealed these records because I couldn't bear to watch it happen again. The cycle, the loss. I swore to myself that the next time, if there was a next time, I wouldn't intervene. You would live your life and be free of the knowledge of what you are. What am I? Isabel's voice shook. You're the daughter of the last High Mage of the Northern Dynasty, Morevith explained, pulling out more photographs. Woman after woman, identical faces across different centuries. You were killed in the Blood War when you were 24 years old. You were caught between a curse cast by my brother. He was trying to protect you from an assassin, and the counter-curse it triggered. The magic was so powerful that instead of death being final, it looped your soul. Every 100 years, you're reborn. Different families, different memories, always the same essential self. And he knew, Isabel gestured at Darius. I knew, Darius confirmed quietly. I've watched you be reborn 9 times over 300 years. I've watched you grow up, watched you become yourself each time, and each time I've tried not to interfere. You had a right to your own life. Until now, Isabel said, until I ended up in the selection. You were always going to end up in the selection, Morevith said. Or something like it. The curse draws you toward him, toward my brother. It's the same magic that created the cycle, and it pulls your reincarnated self back to the one person responsible for your situation. This time, you simply decided to try to escape it. Isabel stood up, moving away from them both. So I'm what? Some magical accident? A soul that's trapped repeating itself? No, Darius said firmly. You're not trapped. That was the point. The original curse is wearing down, magic as old as this eventually does. The cycle is weakening. The fact that you're conscious enough to attempt to fake your own illness, that you have enough self-awareness to want a different life, that suggests the next rebirth might be your last one. My last one. If you survive this cycle, Morevith explained, you'll finally be free. The curse will break completely. You'll either die as a natural person dies, or the magic will release your soul entirely. Either way, no more rebirths. Isabel felt like she was spinning. So what, I'm supposed to just accept this? Accept that my entire life is built on a lie, that I'm not actually who I think I am? You are who you think you are, Darius said. Your personality, your preferences, your values, those are all genuinely you. They persist across every incarnation. You always ask questions. You always prefer books to people. You always choose autonomy over security. These things about you are real. How am I supposed to trust anything when my memories aren't real? The same way anyone does, Darius replied. By choosing to accept what you know to be true now, regardless of what came before. You can't change what you were or what happened. You can only decide what you want to happen next. Isabel turned away from them, walking to the window of the sealed chamber. Outside, she could see the city beyond the palace walls, people living their ordinary lives, unaware of the magical underpinnings that held their kingdom together. If the curse breaks, she said slowly, what happens to you and me, to whatever this is? She gestured vaguely at both of them. Then you choose, Darius said. Not because of magic, not because of a curse, not because of selection politics or prophecy. You choose because you want to. And if I don't want to, then you're free to go, completely, utterly free. No rebirths waiting in your future, no magic pulling at your soul. You get to be a normal person who gets exactly one life, and you get to live it however you want. Isabel turned back to look at him. In the strange light of the sealed room, she could see the centuries in his eyes, all the lives he'd lived, all the times he'd watched her grow up, all the times he'd walked away. This is why you visited me, she said. Not because I was interesting, because you knew. It's why I visited you partially, Darius acknowledged. But you were also genuinely interesting, and I was also genuinely curious about what you do when you realize the truth. I need time, Isabel said. I need to think about this, all of this. Morevith nodded. You'll stay in the palace, you're free to do whatever you like within reason. Read, walk, think, we'll give you a week to decide. A week, Isabel felt her voice rise. A week to process 9 reincarnations worth of context. If we leave you longer, the other selection candidates and the court will start to ask questions, Morevith said practically. A week is also the maximum time before the genuine need to make an announcement becomes pressing. Choose to stay and try to understand what you are, or choose to leave and take your freedom. Either way, we need a decision. Charming, Isabel muttered. Decades of freedom in theory, but 1 week in practice. She left them there in the sealed chamber and walked back to the palace proper, back to the isolation room that now felt less like shelter and more like a cage. But at least, she thought, at least now she understood why she'd always felt like she didn't quite fit in her own life. The week passed in a strange blur. Isabel read every journal entry that Darius provided, accounts of her previous lives, written in his careful handwriting. In 1823, she'd been a scholar's daughter with an interest in natural philosophy. In 1723, she'd been a merchant's wife with a talent for negotiation. In 1623, she'd been a revolutionary who'd fought against tyranny. Each version was distinctly herself, yet somehow a completely different person. She walked through the palace gardens and actually ran into some of the other selection candidates. They were confused about her illness but polite. She was, after all, the Vampire King's mysterious interest, and even if she was weak and feverish, she carried some of his implicit approval. She didn't speak to Darius during that week. He didn't try to force interaction, but she'd occasionally catch him watching her from balconies or across courtyards, his expression unreadable. On the 6th day, she made a decision. She went to Moravith's study and asked for everything: the full uncensored history of the Blood War, the complete journal entries, the names of the mages who'd originally cast the cycle curse. "You're going to want revenge," Moravith guessed, watching her. "No," Isabel said, "I'm going to understand, and then I'm going to choose." She spent the last 2 days of her week locked in her room with 17 volumes of history and documentation. She read about the war, about the political tensions that had created it, about Darius's desperate attempt to protect her from an assassination curse that had gone catastrophically wrong. She read about the mages who'd created the cycle spell, good people who'd been trying to save her life, not trap it. She read about the century since, about how Darius had watched each rebirth with increasing pain, how he'd finally sealed the records away because he couldn't bear to interfere anymore. And she understood, not immediately, not completely, but gradually. She understood that nothing about her life was a lie, her feelings were real, her personality was real, her desire for autonomy was real, but she also understood that she existed because of magic, because of accident, because of love gone wrong. On the morning she had to choose, she woke up and realized her fever was completely gone. She hadn't adjusted the herbal mixture in days. She'd forgotten about it entirely during her week of research. Her body had simply healed itself. The artificial fever had run its course, and she was left exhausted but healthy. It felt like a sign. She showered, dressed, and went to find Darius. He was in the palace library, which somehow didn't surprise her. He was reading when she entered, and he looked up immediately as if he'd been waiting. "The week is over," she said. "It is. I want to ask you something, and I want the absolute truth." "Of course. If I say no, if I choose to leave, to take my freedom and go, what happens? Do you still harbor me resentment for wasting your time? Do you prevent me from leaving? Do you?" "I let you go," Darius said firmly. "And I mean that in the deepest sense. I let your magic free. I speak the countercurse that breaks the cycle. You become a normal human being and you live a normal life and you never see me again if that's what you want." "And you be sad," Isabel said. "It wasn't a question." "Devastated," Darius corrected. "But your freedom is more important to me than my own happiness. That's always been the problem, isn't it? That's why I sealed the records. I was tired of sacrificing you to my own needs." Isabel moved to the chair across from him and sat down. "I'm not the person you watched die 300 years ago." "No, you're the person she became when she was reborn. But you're still in love with her, with all of them, with me." Darius set down his book carefully. "I'm in love with a person who keeps being brave, who keeps choosing to question her life and demand better from it, who reads philosophy and likes botany, and apparently enjoys infuriating a 300-year-old vampire king by faking fevers to escape selection ceremonies." Isabel surprised herself by laughing, a genuine, full-bodied laugh that felt like it came from somewhere deep inside her. "Okay," she said when she'd composed herself. "Here's what I've decided. I want to break the cycle. I don't want to spend 9 more lives being reborn. I want this to be my one shot at real, unmagical existence. Darius's face went carefully neutral. But, Isabel continued, that's not the only thing I want. I also want, and I'm going to say this very clearly so there's no confusion, I want to choose you. Not because magic is pulling me toward you. Not because 9 reincarnations have built up some kind of soul debt. But because in the week I was confined to that room, you were the only thing that made sense in a world that had suddenly become completely incomprehensible. And because, despite everything about you that should terrify me, I genuinely like who you are. Are you sure? Darius asked quietly, not influenced by the fever, not confused by the documentation. I'm sure. I'm also absolutely sure that I still want to spend significant time in your library, that I'm not becoming some traditional bride who's going to stop reading philosophy, and that I'm going to continue to be difficult and argumentative and probably annoying. I wouldn't have you any other way, Darius said, and he sounded like he meant it. Then I'm choosing to stay, and I'm choosing you. But I'm also choosing to do the cycle-breaking ritual tomorrow, so I'm doing this as a human who will eventually grow old and die, not as an immortal or a magical object. You're certain. I'm certain. Darius stood, moved to her and took her hands. His fingers were cool but not unpleasantly so. Then we'll do the ritual tomorrow in the presence of Moravath and the Mage Council, and then, if you still want it, we can discuss what comes next. What does come next? Isabel asked, in practical terms. That's entirely up to you. If you want to be my bride, I'll marry you. If you want to be my lover and nothing more, that's acceptable. If you want to spend 5 years traveling the world and then coming back to the palace to work as the head of the library, we can arrange that. You have actual autonomy now. Genuine choice. I want to go back to the selection, Isabel said suddenly. Darius blinked. I'm sorry. Not as a candidate, as an observer. I want to see the rest of the selection play out just to understand how the whole process works. And then after that, after I've broken the cycle and recovered from whatever breaking a curse does to a person, then I want to actually spend time with you. Real time. Months of getting to know each other as people, not as magic or destiny or fate. That's a fair request, Darius agreed. Moravath will be delighted, actually. The people have been wildly curious about why the king suddenly withdrew from the selection mid-month. I have one more condition, Isabel added. Name it. When I eventually agree to marry you, and I probably will, you should know that now I'm not trying to keep you in suspense. I get to do it wearing whatever I want, and I get to keep my own name, and I want a library named after me. Darius laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that echoed through the library. A library named after you. I'm going to spend so much time reading, it's only fair that I'm properly credited. Agreed, all of it agreed. The cycle-breaking ceremony happened the next morning in the oldest part of the palace, surrounded by the kingdom's most powerful mages. Isabel drank a potion that tasted like starlight and forgetting. She felt magic unwind from her soul like threads being pulled loose. There was a moment of absolute silence where she seemed to exist in no time at all, and then she was back in the room, gasping for breath, completely and entirely human. Moravath was the first to approach her. How do you feel? Like I just shed my entire past and stepped into an unknown future, Isabel said breathlessly. So, normal morning, really. Darius took her hand. You're free now, actually genuinely, finally free. The selection continued for 2 more weeks with Isabel observing from the shadows, taking notes about which candidates seemed genuinely interested in governance and which ones were just interested in the prestige. It was fascinating, in an anthropological way. She shared her observations with Darius in the evenings, and he listened to her like her thoughts actually mattered. Because he said they did. 3 months later, after Darius had dismissed the other candidates, gently, fairly, with appropriate compensation for their trouble, after Isabel had fully recovered from the curse breaking and spent weeks in the library researching magical theory, she found herself in the garden at sunset, and Darius asked her the question they both knew was coming. I love you, he said simply. Across 9 reincarnations and 300 years I love you. I want to spend the rest of your human life with you, however long that is. Will you marry me? Yes, Isabel said, but I want my library first, and I want the option to get divorced if you turn out to be terrible. Fair enough, I'll have the palace architects start on the library design tomorrow, and I want you to know that I will do my absolute best not to be terrible, but if I am, I won't stop you from leaving." They were married a year later in a ceremony where Isabel wore a dress she'd designed herself, practical, elegant, and featuring pockets. She read a poem she'd written during her months in the library. The ceremony was attended by thousands, but what she remembered afterward was Darius's hand holding hers and the way he smiled like he'd finally, after 300 years, found something worth existing for. The library was built within 2 years, a sprawling structure of glass and wood and light. It became famous across the kingdom as a place of genuine scholarship. Isabel ran it with an iron fist and a kind heart, ensuring it was accessible to everyone, regardless of station or wealth. She lived to be 97 years old. She filled that library with thousands of books. She had 2 children who showed absolutely no magical abilities and were devastatingly normal, which made her inordinately happy. When she died, peacefully in her sleep, next to a man who had loved her longer than she'd been alive, Darius closed the library for a month in mourning. Then he reopened it, because that's what Isabel would have wanted, and he sponsored a scholarship in her name for students studying magical theory and history. He lived another 300 years, but he never married again. When people asked why, he would smile sadly and say that he'd already spent an eternity looking for his soulmate, and now that he'd finally had her, he was content to remember. The portrait of Isabel hung in the library entrance for 3 centuries, a reminder that the strangest and most meaningful things could happen to a person who was clever enough to fake a fever and brave enough to choose her own future. Share your favorite impossible love story, the ones that remind us that sometimes destiny needs a little help from human determination. If you want extended stories, join my Patreon and get extended stories, exclusive character backstories, writing tips and creative guidance, direct access to Ask Me Anything, early access to new releases. Your support isn't just a subscription, it's becoming part of a complete storytelling universe. Start your journey at Patreon, link is in description.